Hello, this is Dr. Stephen Jones, and this is the first part of decision analysis. And in this situation, we're going to take a look at some early ways to analyze data to try to make decisions. The first concept here that we need to look at is that we need to understand what is a good decision. And a good decision is one generally that you use data on rather than just gut feelings. And quite often, if we're snap decision makers or if we just go with our gut, we're going with feelings, which is not a bad thing in a lot of situations. And you have to do that under stress sometimes for things in your personal life. But with a business decision, which is what this is all about, you really shouldn't make those kinds of decisions. You should step back, take a look at what evidence you have before you, and make the best decision you can based upon everything that you have at hand. You won't know every possible piece of information. You won't know necessarily every possible alternative or outcome, or every reason behind whatever situation that you're in. But based on the best information that you have, make the best best decision. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to define what the situation is. You have to be sure that you understand what the real problem or the real opportunity is that faces you. And just as an example out of life that could happen, if you found that you had something was just not feeling right about you, and you decided to go take a cold pill because you kind of felt like maybe you were stopped up. Well, that might take care of some symptoms, but it might not take care of a problem at hand. Or if your muscles ached a little bit, you might take an aspirin or some other analgesic, and that might be fine. On the other hand, there could be a larger problem that you don't know about. And so while it's not necessary to run off to the doctor whenever anything happens to not be going well, you probably don't need to find yourself only doing self-medication. So finding a way to clearly define the problem is important. And in business, that's very, very important, because what you really want is to definitely make choices based on clearly understanding what's right there in front of you. Once you've defined the problem at hand, at least the best that you can, find out what your different alternatives are for actions that you might be able to take. What things can you do? If you look at each one of those actions, then you have expected outcomes. And what are those outcomes? Once you've figured out some of those outcomes, or potentially states of nature, which is if you took an action, what would the economy be like, or what would the labor situation be like, etc. That could be the thing that you start making your decisions about. So now you have a relatively well-defined problem, alternatives that you can take to either solve that problem or take care of an opportunity, situations that you're in, or possible outcomes there, and then what's the payoff? In this situation, typically we're looking at profit that's out there. It could be acquisition of new markets. It could be labor difficulties, any number of things out there. Then take a decision model that seems to fit that situation and use it to calculate out what you think your best options are. And you have some level of decision-making ability out of that. So let's take a look at an example. The Thompson Lumber Company that's in your text. If you define the problem as it comes from that example is the opportunity to expand into a new market, and that market would be backyard storage sheds. So they find that opportunity out there and they wonder, should they go into that or not? If they decide that they might go into that market, they're going to have to take a look at, can they handle the demand that would be coming up for that market out there. If they look at that opportunity, they could attack that opportunity by constructing a new large plant to be able to start making more of those backyard shelves. They could decide to be more cautious and create a smaller new plant just in case the market isn't as big or doesn't go for their sheds quite as much as what the most optimistic outlook would be. Or they could just decide to do it with their own current facilities and take whatever advantage they can right now without putting any money out. And that would be a more pessimistic view. While they would still be going into a new market, they wouldn't be putting any extra money out. So if the market failed, then they wouldn't have lost anything out of there. Now, they are doing this in this situation under states of nature. In other words, what could the market do? And they have defined that as favorable or unfavorable markets. That, it's all positive or it's all negative. So in this situation here, if they have a favorable outlook, there are certain payoffs that come from that. And if there's an unfavorable, then there'll be certain payoffs that come from that as well. And those can be at least guessed at. It's not perfect, but those would be estimations that they could come up with. And we'll look at that in the next screen coming up, what they think those are. Based upon those, then they would have a decision model to consider. And that's going to be based on, whether or not they feel better about a favorable market or an unfavorable market. It's going to be how risk averse they are. If they're very cautious, then they would take the least adventurous path. And if they happen to be more adventurous, then they would let risk go away and decide to go a different route. Then essentially they would apply that model to the data that they have. So let's take a look at some of those. They have calculated that under a favorable market, they would probably make another $200,000 in profit if they went with a large plant. If they went with a small plant, they'd probably make an extra $100,000. So it would still be an increase in profit over doing nothing. But there would not be as much as if in a favorable market if they had gone with a large plant. On the other hand, if they do nothing, if they just stay with what they're doing right now, they can expect to neither lose nor gain any money out of it. And that's fine. They would just be doing the same thing that they're doing, but that would be the most cautious of those options. If, on the other hand, it turned out that it was an unfavorable market, they could expect to lose $180,000. Why? Well, because they would have constructed this large new plant and they would have done marketing and they had research to go into it, and they've lost all of that investment, and there may be more money that they would lose otherwise. They might just make enough money to not lose $500,000 or whatever, but they would definitely have a big loss if it turned out to be an unfavorable market and they'd made a major investment. and take a look at the small plant. If they made an investment, but not as huge an investment, and it was an unfavorable market, they wouldn't lose as much. They'd still lose some money, but they wouldn't lose as much. And again, if they didn't do anything different, then they would make the same amount of profit in an unfavorable market that they would have made in an unfavorable market all along. They haven't gone out and spent any extra money. Now, what this says here is not that they're going to make the same amount of money if they do nothing, that they'll make the same amount of money under a favorable market and an unfavorable market. That's not what that's saying. What it's saying is that by doing nothing, they wouldn't have done worse or better in those situations. So they might lose money in a do-nothing situation in an unfavorable market. They might see, well, not necessarily lose money, but they might see their profits drop, just like they would have anyway. But under an unfavorable market, they would see not only that drop, but an extra $180,000 less if they construct the big plant, and an extra $20,000 less if they constructed a small plant. So above and beyond what they would have done under normal conditions with no extra outlay, that's what they're finding themselves faced with. So how do they decide which of these is right? Well, again, part of it depends on, are they risk averse? Are they risk takers? Are they cautious? Are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic? And how well do they know the situation that they're facing? Relatively rarely do we make decisions under total certainty. Now, we can be pretty certain about some things because of experience, because of lots of data, because we really know the situation very well. We can have a fair amount of certainty in certain situations. Just like if we have no experience with a situation, and really nobody else does either, then we find ourselves under uncertainty. That we know we don't know, and we're not certain what it is we don't know. As you know, you've heard that saying, we know what we know what we don't know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. Those are 4 different situations you can find yourself in. So if you know a lot and it's true, then you're in a situation of certainty. And if you're not even sure what you don't know, then you're in a situation of total uncertainty. Most of us don't find ourselves in that. We find ourselves knowing some things and not knowing some other things, and realizing that there's a level of risk that comes about. And so we can throw probabilities at that. Well, based on what I do know and my experience out there, it looks like I'm pretty certain that XYZ is probably likely. But if, it snows instead, or if, oil prices go up, or whatever you're talking about, there is some risk that I could be wrong. And we understand that. So most of our life situations are like that. Your business decisions are going to be like that as well. So you find yourself a lot of times more optimistic or more pessimistic based on your own views towards whatever risk is. Take a look at this slide, and if we were to use what's known as a maxi-max decision analysis with that same table that we just looked at with possibilities out there, if we found ourselves pretty optimistic that we really knew a lot of information and we had a favorable outlook on all our alternatives out there, then we would want to find ourselves with what brings us the most money. So you look for whatever the maximum profit is for each row. And Then you look at that final column where you get all the maximum profits, and you look for whatever that maximum is in that column, because that's the biggest number in that whole table. And so the maximum number in the whole table is the choice to construct a large plant because you feel very favorable about the marketplace. So if you do a Maximax, you find the biggest number out there that's a positive number, and you choose to go with that. Okay? If you find yourself instead pessimistic, that you believe bad things happen, it's not that you want bad things happen, you just believe bad things happen, or you feel that the market's more unfavorable, or you feel that oil prices are going to go up or down, whichever's worse in your case, then you would choose a less optimistic or a more pessimistic viewpoint. In this case, you want to maximize the minimum. Now, that does not mean you want the worst thing to happen. What you want to find is, let's suppose the worst thing did happen. What's our best alternative? So Maximax is, well, let's suppose the best thing happens. What's the best thing? Under Maximin, you suppose the worst things happen. And so you want to find the best in a bad situation. So you find out what the worst numbers are in each row, and then you find the best worst number, and that's going to be the 0. So under the best situation, you would choose to construct the large plant because it's got the highest positive number. Under the unfavorable market, you would choose to do nothing because it's got the least bad option out there. But we typically are not perfectly optimistic, and we're not perfectly pessimistic. We realize that most of life is somewhere in between, and so that's the criterion of realism. How pessimistic are you versus how optimistic are you? If you feel that generally things are pretty good, that generally things are going to go your way, that you would choose a more optimistic, but you realize there's some possibility of not getting the best out there, and you would choose to be somewhere in between, but more on the positive side. And obviously, if you felt more pessimistic, not totally, but more pessimistic, you choose a less rosy outlook. Well, the criterion of realism, or Hurwitz's situation, is a weighted average, where you allow yourself to say, well, I believe one of these is X% likely to happen, and the other is the opposite of that. So if you were completely pessimistic, you'd have a 0 weight here for your alpha. And if you're perfectly optimistic, you'd have a 1 weight for the alpha. So that you would put, if you were an optimist, you would put all of the possibilities on the favorable. And if you're pessimistic, you'd put all of the options on the unfavorable. Since most of us are somewhere in between, we would choose, say, if you were 60% positive that things were going to go well, you choose, say, a 0.6, so that you would weight 0.6 on the favorable market side and 0.4 on the unfavorable. And if, on the other hand, you were 60% certain that things were going to go south, then you put 60% of the weight on the unfavorable and 40% on the favorable. And then you would come up with a table relatively like this. And in this situation here, you find they've decided they're 80% positive instead of 80% negative. They're 80% positive, 20% negative, and that's how they come up with these numbers here. So the 200,000 times 0.8, 200,000 times 0.8, and then 180,000 on the negative times 0.2. So this is 160 because 200,000 times 0.8 is 160,000, and 0.2 times 180,000 negative would be negative 36,000. So 160,000 minus 36,000 gives you 124,000. And you do that for each row, and then you find out under criterion of realism what's the best of these alternatives. So this number is 124,000, 76,000, and this is obviously 0 because 0 times anything is still 0. If, on the other hand, you look at the Laplace selection and you believe that you don't know what the outcomes are, you can't be more positive or more negative, then you weight each one of them equally out there, and you try to find if all situations are equally likely, which one is most likely to occur. And you apply, in this situation, since there's only two states of nature, you would apply 50% favorable, 50% unfavorable. Which of these has the largest number at that situation? And in this case, it's the construct a small plant. Because under equally likely, if it's just as likely that you would have favorable or unfavorable, then you would go with the small plant. Whereas if it were more likely to be favorable, you would have gone with the large plant. Finally, we look at the mini-max. And in this situation, we're trying to look at, as it says, opportunity loss or regret. And we are trying to find out, in that situation, where are we going to maximize our abilities to look at the minimum loss. So we want to find, and I'll show you how to do this in solving a problem in a different video here. You would construct your table so that you're actually looking for what the biggest losses are out there, or the most regret that you might have, and you want to minimize that level of regret. That's all for part one. Take care.